I'm super excited about this interview today because it's all about research. Now, I have to admit, I never thought that I would develop a passion for research, yet here I am at the tail end of completing my doctorate. Research has become a huge part of my life, and when you meet fellow dyslexics who are researching in the field of dyslexia, I feel a sense of hope for the changes that are occurring within our community. Today's guest speaker is Professor Stephen Macdonald. Stephen is a Professor of Social Science at the University of Sunderland. He has published broadly in the areas of neurodiversity and social exclusion, including issues concerning diagnosis, educational disengagement, digital inclusion, crime, victimisation, loneliness and homelessness. Stephen is a fellow dyslexic and is an inspiration to me, and I hope through this podcast you feel inspired too. Thank you so much for joining me my evening, your morning, Stephen. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us on the show.
I'm so excited to be talking to you, and particularly for my own selfish reasons of doing my doctorate at the moment, but also some of your work I've learned is very similar to what I'm trying to do in Australia around showcasing some of the challenges that those with dyslexia face. So I'm really, really excited to be talking to you today. And first of all, can I please ask you to give our listeners a little bit of a background to yourself if they haven't heard of your work before?
Yes, would you like us to give a background of me work, or first of all with me work? Yep, so I'm Steve Macdonald. I'm a Professor of Social Science, and I work at the University of Sunderland. And I work in a team which very much draws on social theory, so it's influenced by sociology, but it actually brings together different professionals, different professional groups. So we work within the team, we have psychologists, we have sociologists, we have criminologists, we have social workers, we have social care specialists, and also people who specialize in childhood development as well. My own research very much focuses on, well, my research started by focusing primarily on dyslexia and the adult experience of dyslexia. Obviously, I have dyslexia myself, so that really influenced my research. I started off within criminology, actually. I first of all trained in criminology. When I was studying my degree, disability didn't really appear within criminology. When I started doing my master's, I came across a paper which illustrated in the UK that dyslexia was overrepresented within the prison system. And I actually got really angry about that, because I thought that my experience during school and leaving school and in the workplace and then going back to university was quite unique. I was somebody who had slipped through the net, and this, the poor experience which I had in education, wasn't universal. But this paper illustrated, especially for working class people, actually, this is very much a universal experience. So this led me into a discipline in the UK called disability studies, which I know is now a global, discipline. So I was introduced to sociologists writing about disability and the social constructed nature of disability. And that very much influenced my research in criminology. And because of that, I expanded into sociology, into social work, into social care, into psychology as well. And that very much framed my research. So my research very much looks at the lived experiences of adults in the workplace, outside of the workplace, in the criminal justice system, in social work and social care, and I'm very much interested in people who have experienced extreme forms of deprivation. So I've looked at homelessness, but that's also led us into looking at the process of labeling. What does dyslexia mean to people in terms of what does that mean in relation to their social identities and their personal identities? Alongside that, because of my research originally started looking at dyslexia and I moved into disability studies, then that opened up into looking at really a very much a new area of disability studies, which looks at areas of crime and victimisation. So alongside my work in dyslexia, I also research in terms of disability hate crime, looking at disability and victimisation, and also in terms of the experience of disabled offenders. So in relation to how they face barriers in custody, barriers in the justice system, and also barriers within the prison system. So in a sense, that is another area of my research. And alongside that, I've looked at, because of my research in dyslexia, issues of technology and assistive technology, etc. And I'm looking to work with a team who really are interested in these issues. And although, you know, I have people from different disciplines, sociology, criminology, psychology, they all in a sense draw on this environmental approach to think about disability as something which is produced within the environment rather than just the physical body. So I think hopefully that sort of summarized what my, you know, my research.
And I'm really excited to talk about these topics, particularly because of the I feel we're caught between a medical and the social model, where the medical model says we're disabled and the social model says it's the environment that disables us. So I'm really excited to unpack that with you. But before we do that, can you tell us a little bit about what life was like for you growing up? Because you've gone through undergrad to masters and then you got your PhD. So how did that evolve for you?
God, sometimes I think by chance, tell you the truth. You know, my early experience, I suppose, to give a brief biography in terms of where I come from. I come from, I live in the northeast. I grew up in the northeast of England. I grew up in a town called Gateshead, which is just next to Newcastle. So Newcastle, it's basically on the other side of the River Tyne. So you've got Newcastle on one side of the river and Gateshead on the other side of the river. So I grew up in Gateshead, and Gateshead is was, not so much now, but was an area of high deprivation. So I grew up in a very traditional working class community in the northeast of England. And I grew up in a time where actually heavy industry was starting to disappear from Newcastle and Gateshead. So my father, who actually left us as a family, like many northeast men, worked in the shipyard. When the shipyards all were closed down in the northeast, they moved to Scotland, and many of them stayed in Scotland. They moved to employment and stayed in Scotland and didn't come home. And that was the case for many families, unfortunately, in the northeast, and I was one of them. I grew up in a council estate in Gateshead, high unemployment, you know, at this period of time in the 1980s and in the early 1990s. You know, to say that I had a very happy childhood, actually, growing up in Gateshead. I grew up in a council estate, which, you know, had some great friends. There was a great community spirit there, although it was a very poor area. And in a sense, at that point in time, I don't think there was, you know, there was many social problems, but maybe not the social problems which would many people would expect for an area like that. So, you know, for the most part, actually, my childhood was happy. My mother, growing up with two sisters, you know, was a really great experience, actually. I had a very happy home life. At school, you know, I struggled. I wasn't diagnosed during mainstream school with dyslexia. We also have intellectual disabilities in our family. So my mother's sister, who very much was part of the family and still is, she has an intellectual impairment. So in terms of when I was starting to struggle at school, the assumption was that this was probably more linked to, at the time it was described as a learning disability. Actually, it turns out that my auntie has autism now. You know, she, you know, as knowledge was very much, it's improved around autism. You know, she was labelled later on, diagnosed later on in later life as having autism. So the assumption was that, you know, I was failing in education. I was coming from a working class background who have intellectual impairments in the family. So that was probably the issue, that it was more to do with intellect rather than something to do with dyslexia. So from a very early age, I went to special needs. You know, I attended special needs classes away from my friends. I was a disruptive child at school. I was probably a bit of a nightmare for many of my teachers. I think I coped with it like many people who I've interviewed. Rather than being somebody who was quiet, I was probably a little bit more disruptive because really I just didn't want to be in a room which were making his, attempt to read, which was embarrassing, which I couldn't do, and also write, which was a real difficulty, and spelling, which is always and still is a problem, and there was numerous occasions where I was humiliated in class. So I remember in juniors being made to spell my second name out, which I couldn't at that point in time, and that was, was a delight to many of me fellow students and friends. So it was one aspect was painful in relation to around literacy, but also I also found other subjects fascinating. History fascinated us, art fascinated us, and I love doing art. So the literacy aspect I struggled with, and I can say that there was significant difficulties both in infants, juniors and seniors. But other subjects, although I didn't excel in because they expect a high literacy level, I actually really loved going to class. I loved listening and I loved taking in the knowledge. So I wouldn't say that, I totally disengaged with education, because I don't think I did. But I very much, I did, I think I developed a passion for education, but, there was always that element that I was constantly sent throughout my education experience to special needs classes, which was really a holding room for people with multiple issues, behavioural issues, multiple different impairment types. And obviously there was an unknown impairment attached to us that I just was not a high achiever. So when I left, I was always quite good at maths, actually. Maths was always something which I was good at, and also I still love maths today. So maths was always good, and the maths teacher was really inspiring, and he's had an big influence on my life. So school was mixed, actually. I didn't necessarily, there was aspects which were difficult. I really despised going to special needs classes, but others, maths, history, things like that, I really loved going. So actually I used to go all the time, and I loved playing, I loved seeing my friends, and I loved sport. And so I have a mixed feeling about education. It wasn't all negative, but there was negative aspects, leaving school. And also I was disruptive. So I imagine many of the teachers, will be surprised that I am now working in education. And I'm sure I really was a pain for many of them teachers. So leaving school, just briefly, because I realize I can go on. So briefly, when I left school, it was expected for us to go to get a trade. So I actually went to, and at the time it was these things, 2-year YTSs, and there was this particular YTS where you had to pass a test and they linked you up with an apprentice. So luckily the test was maths, so very little reading, and I passed it, and I was meant to become a plumber, but it turned out because there was another recession, there wasn't enough plumbers, so basically I was stuck as a labourer. And then they give us a bricklaying apprenticeship, which I despised, and I realised working on site wasn't for me. And I found it really dull, not taken away from many of my friends who work in the building trades. I don't mean to, but it just was not for me. Also in my family, I had many people who were in the military. So, and my sister worked in the RAF, and basically passing the test again in the military was a big problem because there's reading and writing. There was expected a level of literacy. So luckily my sister had access to the assessments. So we went through and I basically memorized what I had to do. And I got into the military, and I spent 4 years in the military. And I worked with medical teams in the military, and I was in 5th Airborne, which was what was seen as a level of special forces, which I was attached to, and I sort of enjoyed it. I enjoyed the sport, but I'm not a very masculine sort of person, so being in the military was almost like I joined the military by mistake. So I knew it wasn't a career for me, but I did enjoy it. I got some great friends. I saw a lot of the world, and it also gives us a lot of life experience. And it also introduced us to the class system, officer class and the soldier class. And that was very important to us, and thinking about how society is organized through this different class system. So it really gives us this class awareness, social class awareness going into the military. I left the military, and because I still had significant literacy problems then, I did actually really try to engage with literacy. So I started trying to improve my literacy levels. So I tried to teach myself to read better. So I remember it was in the military, I read my first book, which took us, about a year to go through, but I really persevered to get through. And I think it was Jim Morrison's biography, because I was a big Doors fan, and it took us ages. And I just kept on trying to persevere, trying to read more and more, try to improve my literacy. My writing never truly improved, but my literacy got a bit better during the military. And my skills actually, learning skills in the military was very good, and working with the health teams, medical teams. So actually I left and I thought, I'm going to become a nurse. And I think, God, so I'd done the pre-join nurse course, and I was planning on becoming a mental health nurse. But straight away, obviously, I got in because of my experience in the military. But then straight away, it was noted the problems which I was having with my literacy skills. And actually, I had a brilliant lecturer, and within the first couple of months, it was pointed out that she thought I had dyslexia. I went for the assessment, and I did. And straight away, I got access to education, which really did help us improve me reading and writing. And also, I was introduced to assistive technologies. Once I was introduced to assistive technologies, everything changed for us. I was suddenly given the tools where I could read and write. I excelled in that course. At the end of that course, actually, I decided that nursing wasn't for me. When I was working out in social care, I don't think I really had thought it through, and it takes a very unique and dedicated person to be a good nurse. Really was interested in research. So I basically signed up for a criminology course, because on top of that, when I came back from the military, lots of the people who I knew, some of them went on to university, but some of them were in the prison system. Some good friends ended up in the prison system. I didn't understand how that happened. So I actually wanted to find out why that happened. So I actually took a criminology and social research, because I really was fascinated with social research. And it allowed us to study psychology, sociology, and criminology. So it seemed like the perfect course. So I'd done a joint honours degree in criminology and social research. And it also had a maths element. So it was less, because I thought I'm always quite good at maths. So there's a big maths element to this. So I'll be all right with that. So that was my first degree. That led straight away onto my master's, which I talked a little bit about when I read that paper on dyslexia. So actually that led us to start researching in the area of dyslexia and young offenders, which led us working in social services with young offenders with literacy issues. And one of my first projects actually was working with the young offenders team, working with young people with literacy issues. I knew these young people were like me, really. And basically what we did was we assessed them for dyslexia. 40% had dyslexia, 60% didn't. And then we put different interventions which I had just experienced really, 4 or 5 years before, which changed my life. And actually what we noted was that people with dyslexia, really it improved their literacy skills to a certain point. And then we used assistive technologies for people without dyslexia, because they had literacy problems because of cultural reasons. Then actually their literacy were improved more rapidly, to the point where actually they could read and write just fine. So that was really important. So that helped us merge criminology with disability studies, with my research, and then basically this led us on to a PhD. I was at this time really had a fascination with social research. And I knew that's what I wanted to do. This was for me. So I applied for a PhD, and surprisingly, about dyslexia and crime and young offenders, and I was accepted straight away. It turned out actually my PhD wasn't on that at all. It included aspects of a group of offenders, but it actually developed into really looking at social theory of dyslexia. And because of that, it's just as I was entering into my PhD, I actually was watching a program, and somebody who became my supervisor, so I was so lucky, Tom Shakespeare, so Professor Tom Shakespeare, who very much at the time was still advocating for the social model. He critiques the social model now, and I listened to him, and this was such an eye-opener for us, because being introduced to the social model completely transformed my perception of the people who I was working with and myself. Because although I had developed, the skills, I was succeeding in education, I had got a degree, which I never thought I would get, and then a master's. And then suddenly I had the confidence to go, and to be honest, every time I took one of them degrees, I didn't think I was going to pass it. I just thought I'll have a go at doing a degree, and if whatever happens, and then I passed it. And I thought I'll have a go at doing a master's, and I passed it. And then I thought, well, I'll have a shot at doing a PhD. I probably won't be able to succeed, but I'll have a go, and I passed. But at the very beginning, Tom was talking about, this program, he was talking about the social model. And this basically said that, disability isn't just about biology or neurology, in terms of, and he was really basically described the biomedical model. He says, the public perception at this point in time is that, disabled people can and can't do certain things because of the biologies, and that limits their how they interact and what they can do and what jobs they can do. And he said that's not the case. He said that actually what it is this is an environmental factors. It's the environment which actually allows disabled people to do certain things and prevents them from doing certain things. And that made us think, wow, that's really amazing. And that made us go and look at the work of Mike Oliver and Colin Barnes, who were very much at the very beginning formulating the work of Vic Finkelstein and Paul Hunt in terms of creating the social model. And and reading Mike Oliver's stuff, and Mike Oliver, and this group of wheelchair users who stated in the 1970s and 1980s, the problem wasn't the fact that they couldn't stand up. The problem is that they couldn't get around the house because the way houses were built. They couldn't get around environments the way environments were built. They couldn't get into workplaces because of stairs, etc. Assumptions were made what they can and can't do based on their bodies, which are actually social constructs rather than the reality of what they can and can't do, because everything is defined by this ideology of a biomedical model. And for me, that transformed the way I thought about myself, the people who I was working with, my participants, and also dyslexia. So the social model completely, so this basically underpinned my research from this point in time. So basically that led into my PhD, what was underpinned by models of disability. And I must admit, I don't just stick to the social model. I use multiple different models, actually, which I think are important. But when I'm thinking about, and especially for the work of offenders, many of the work which I was looking at during my master's research and early PhD research, and even now, if you look at it, it relates dyslexia with overrepresentation of people in the prison system and links it to signs and symptoms of dyslexia, neurological dysfunctions, which maybe lead people at risk of engaging in offending behavior. And that seemed outrageous to me when I was doing that research, that actually the reason why people with dyslexia are overrepresented in the prison system isn't because they have a neurological divergence or difference or impairment. The reason why they have is because they've experienced extreme forms of deprivation like any other overrepresented group in the prison system. So it's not about biology, it's really about, the structural effects of society, which, excludes and leads people into pathways of exclusion. So in a sense, this is which, these are the ideas which sort of underpin my research. Yeah, I hope that made sense.
Yes, it did. And I've got so many questions, but being dyslexic, I haven't retained a lot of them. I should have been writing them down as you were talking. I was thinking as you were talking about I would like to talk to you about how you managed to do your PhD with dyslexia and what assistive technology and supports you put in place. But with the social model of disability, how do you think we can, because you need an assessment to then be able to access funding support or reasonable adjustments in the workplace or things like that. So is there a way that we can blend both so that it's a nice marriage, or do you think we really need to shift to the social model of disability where we don't need an assessment anymore and just the environment changes so we don't have to be adapting all the time?
Yeah, that is a brilliant question, and this is something which straight away when I started doing my PhD and I started working with Tom, and I switched the focus from just one group to, I thought, well, actually, there's no social theory here around dyslexia. So actually, that's the starting point before I start looking at particular groups. We need to think about more broadly. So I actually interviewed in my PhD people from. I used social class actually as a framework. So I looked at people from multiple different social class groups to see if they're looking at their experience from disability studies, rather than actually assuming how people live their lives, based on professional knowledge. Let's look at how people actually live their lives and lived experiences. Now, first of all, in terms of, I realized that the social model almost drifts away from the idea of any form of, assessment. Although I think Mike Oliver and Colin Barnes have stated that that's not what they state. They say that actually medical intervention can be useful, but actually once we leave the clinic, then actually this is in a social space. So that's where we'll have to think about disabling barriers and environmental adjustments. So actually, when I was looking at this, very much I thought that we need to take a more micro interactive approach rather than just a broad approach. And I think this is where I use the social model when I'm looking at certain things, broad aspects of disability, but I use different models in thinking about, when we're looking at the micro and the macro. So, I wrote a paper not long ago, actually trying to define, not saying what, define different models of disability and different ideas around dyslexia. And I've suggested that maybe there's 6. There's more than that, but I suggested 6 useful ones. And actually, assessment and diagnosis is vital. For many of us with dyslexia, and I've already described in my own biography that I wasn't diagnosed until actually I went to college. That was late on. And actually that diagnosis, and I do use the term diagnosis because many people call it labeling and assessment. I actually don't mind using the term diagnosis, because it is a diagnosis. I do see there is an impairment effect of dyslexia. There is a reality of dyslexia, and I see it as a biological, neurological reality, what underpins dyslexia. In terms of assessment is vital, and one of my first papers I wrote off was about this, how can we negotiate, the importance of assessment and diagnosis with actually the social model and this structural approach, and I think we can. So in terms of within my PhD, I developed a critical realist approach, which very much looks at the embodied experience, how the physical body interacts within social space. So rather than a very macro approach, which the social model takes, looking at universal barriers, which affects all disabled people, I wanted to take a micro approach. Well, how does disabling barriers affect people with dyslexia? Yep. So this was a very interactionist approach. Later on, in terms of, I've originally referred to this as a critical realist approach. I used a critical realist approach, which you then applied the social model of disability. I think later on people have referred to this approach within disability studies as the social relational model. Now, within disability studies, what you've got is, especially Tom Shakespeare started critiquing the social model as being limited because it ignores biology. And I agree with him to a certain extent on that. But actually, I think that actually to work through this, we need to recognize, multiple models of dyslexia, and not saying that we will just use one model. Actually, what we can do is use multiple different approaches, and critical realist, that's a theoretical approach which I apply, very much allows us to do that. So for instance, when I'm talking to my students, if you don't mind just giving this example about the different ideas of disability, the idea in terms of the social model versus the medical model, I don't think is very useful. Actually, I think both are useful. So actually, I see the biomedical model in terms of within a clinical setting is being very useful. And I always use an example of actually something which happened to us a few years ago. And what medicine does, it oversimplifies the body through a mean measurement. Yeah, so we've got the fully functional body, and everything else, is really about how the body dysfunctions. And the key focus is really about disease. So how does disease or injury affect the body? Yeah, and how has it moved away from its mean measurement, and how can medical interventions move it back to its mean measurement? Right now, about 2 years ago, I suddenly got out of bed, and I do a lot of fitness and things like that, and I got a pain in my arm. and I've got very mild asthma, but it doesn't usually affect us. But my breathing was really heavy. And I said to my wife, I'm really not feeling good today. And then she said, ring up, our number for, services, not emergencies. We've got another one. And said, I just want an appointment with the doctor. And straight away they said, we're sending around an ambulance, think you have a heart attack? I said, no, I'm not. I'm definitely not. I'm not old enough to have a heart attack. I'm quite fit. And they said, no, we're sending one round. I said, well, tell you the truth. I live next to a hospital, so I'm going to go there. And it turned out I didn't have a heart attack. Actually, I had a viral infection, but it was affecting my body functions. So I went there, they assessed my body. It was no longer functioning the way it was. So they looked at my mean measurement, they looked at how it moved from mean measurement, then they put an intervention to remove it back. Now, for me, that's very useful because it could have developed into something far more serious. That's the beauty of modern medicine. And I think that's really successful within a clinical setting. When we're outside of a clinical setting, this ideology is often applied to say why disabled people can and can't do certain things in society. And that was, Mike Oliver and Colin Barnes's idea was that actually, Paul Hunt, actually, one of the architects of the social model, he said that medical intervention, when he left hospital, offered him nothing, you know what I mean, except he was living in an institution, except for a system of social control. So we need to think of a better way. And that's what I see. The medical model is very useful within a clinical setting. Outside of a clinical setting, it becomes oppressive because it becomes an ideology while people think about bodies, where it shouldn't be used like that. It should just be used within a clinical setting. So the social model offers us something, an alternative. So once we've left medicine, once we've left hospital, our bodies are permanently change, or we've been born with different bodies. Now, that's where the social model becomes useful, because it looks at environmental factors and structural factors in institutional systems of discrimination. And that's where it's very useful to make sure we're included in the workforce, to make sure we're included in education, to make sure we're included within social life, and deconstruct assumptions and stigmas which are attached around our conditions. And I think that's where the social model becomes very useful. The problem with the social model is it's too broad, because Mike Oliver and Colin Barnes, and you might respond to this and say that I'm misinterpreting them, but actually, for my interpretation of this is that said impairment isn't important, that to create a political movement, disabled people all need to come together. And I agree with that, with different impairments, because that gives us a powerful voice. But actually, on a micro level, impairment is important. People with dyslexia experience different barriers from people with, with bipolar, or people who are wheelchair users, or people with a hearing impairment. I also have a hearing impairment. So they experience different barriers. So from a micro level, I think we need to think about how our impairments engage, operate on a day-to-day level. Now, this approach is now often referred to the social relational model. So how the physical body interacts with social environments on a micro level. So this is where I talk about the importance of using the social relational model, looking at particular impairment types and the unique barriers which they experience, which are different from other impairments. And we also, alongside that, have what's often referred to as the affirmation model, which is a cultural model, which very much tries to transform the negative understandings of disability and the discourses attached to disability to actually celebrate disability as a minority group. And again, that's very much underpinned by post-structuralist theory. But actually, I see that as a really useful model, and I see that being used in the Paralympics and etc., with the superhuman discourses and the differences and etc. So I also see that being useful. It can also cause problems because many of us don't have these superpowers. You know what I mean? It's sort of the super in disability studies often referred to as the super crippling effect, but in terms of, but it's also an important tool so for me, in terms of what we see in terms of there's multiple models, and I've only referred to 3 social models. I've referred to one because we also have the social relational, the biopsychosocial model, which is really a clinical model which is used outside of the clinical setting as a public health system. But again, that can be oppressive for disabled people sometimes, but used in the right way. If it's used for illness and health, then that's important. And I think we need to separate health an illness from disability where our bodies permanently change. And I think that's really important as a movement. And I know that I haven't mentioned neurodiversity and the new neurodiverse movement, which is development. And I think it's really useful and it's important. I like the idea that dyslexia is it's part of this neurodiverse community, that actually this isn't about dysfunction, this is about difference. I've always referred to as difference and variation in my research. The problem is where we get to the point where I know that members of this community are now saying, let's not call ourselves disabled people at all, because the term disability is a medical label. It's inherently negative. So we're actually closer to other minority populations, such as people from ethnic minority groups or sexual minority groups, etc. And actually, there is similarities between us, but actually, I think I would argue, especially people who I work with, there is always an impairment effect, and that always needs to be brought into the calculation. So that's what makes it different from these other communities. There isn't an impairment effect in relation to when we're thinking about, race and ethnicity or sexual orientation, where there is in terms of disability. And also, if we abandon disability, then we remove ourselves from the disability movement and disability politics. And that's what's made our voice strong on a global scale. So I would say that, I also argue dyslexia isn't just a social construct. From a disability is a social construct, and dyslexia is a reality, but the experience of dyslexia is socially produced and socially constructed. But that's the case for all disabled people. And there's a great paper wrote by Nick Watson, in 2002, and I can't remember the exact title of it, but it's something like, I don't know about you, but I'm not disabled. And he looked at people with, in the UK, more obvious types of disability, physical impairments, wheelchair users, and none of them saw themselves as being a disabled person. They all said, yeah, I'm a wheelchair user, but, and sometimes when but I run a business, I'm not like what you think about disabled people, because there's stigma attached to that. So many people don't associate themselves with a whole range of impairments. So I think that neurodiversity is a useful description, and it can allow us to construct stigma, and I think it's a useful political movement as well, but I would be cautious of separating ourselves from the disability movement. Sorry, I hope I haven't just went off the path there.
I concur with you, because I feel that the neurodiversity movement, even though it's really important and it's getting people talking, it kind of dilutes the different challenges that we have. And I think that's exactly what you've just said. And I think, we've been looking at developing training in the workforce, and they want to say, well, everyone's different, the people I've been working with, and we have to accommodate for everyone. I said, yes, that's true, but we have a distinct set of challenges that other people won't have. And so we want to be inclusive of everyone, but we still are going to need a certain amount of assistive technology or reasonable adjustments to help us do our job.
Absolutely.
And you can't pull that apart, even though everyone wants to be inclusive of every difference. You actually have to treat those impairments, disorders, whatever you'd like to call them, disabilities, as unique as well. And then it's how do we bring us all together to appreciate the diversity within a workforce as well.
Because I think even using the term impairment in terms of, I don't see that is such a problem in relation to, because impairment, yes, in a clinical setting, in terms of, because they're thinking about changes to the body. We're going through a global pandemic, so in terms of the biomedical model is very useful in terms of in clinical settings to try to treat COVID. So they're looking at sudden changes within these clinical settings. But actually, once our bodies are changed permanently, we no longer need to think about impairment as a neurological, biological dysfunction. We can see it as a variation, a natural variation. So it draws on to the same arguments in relation to what the neurodiverse movement actually is trying to achieve. And I celebrate that, because if you look back, right the way back, I've always replaced dysfunction, with variation or difference. But actually, we do need to recognize how our bodies are different and how they interact in different ways. So I don't have a problem saying that, you know. I don't know if have you asked us the question in terms of how do I pass my PhD, and I haven't answered that question. What about technology?
In a minute.
Oh, we're going to go on to that one, right? So, so I've got multiple different examples in terms of how, you know, I use assistive technologies to, you know, on a day-to-day basis, which, you know, I have to. But, you know, and I conceptualize that as an alternative writing style. But people without dyslexia can use assistive technologies, and they can read and write without them. They've got, you know, the choice, where from my experience and many of the people who I work with, and I do admit I'm working with people who experience significant difficulties. I have worked with successful, I hate the word successful, you know, people who have achieved from a neoliberal perspective, you know, they're running businesses, and they're medics and they're surgeons, and you know, so dyslexia hasn't been such an issue. So I do work with them, but I work more with excluded groups. So I do see in terms of the impact dyslexia has, you know, within these groups and within my own life as well. And so I do think that we do have to think about how our neurologies, how our bodies, how dyslexia makes us different, and that's really important, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does, and it's been fascinating to listen to your research. And I could talk to you all night about it, especially because, as I mentioned earlier before we started the interview, that one of my papers is looking at social construct and labels and superpowers versus disability. Yeah. But moving on from your research, and you've just started to touch on it, but how do you manage day to day? So if we've got our listeners that are doing a doctorate or PhD, which we're getting more and more people coming to us saying they are, that are dyslexic, you know, what are some of the suggestions you might have for them around how they could manage, or what were some of the things that you put in place to help support you?
I think, first of all, I know that you already know this, and I think all your listeners already know this, but dyslexia is experienced differently by multiple different people. So it's hard for us, and especially with many of the groups I work with, you know, I'm working with people with significant literacy issues. So I work with many, you know, I'm not the only person in my team who has dyslexia, but we are affected in different ways. So my experience of dyslexia, as I've already described, you know, my reading and writing is affected. My speech is affected. Actually, I very rarely do that many interviews because I am always conscious about using words out of context, getting word blocks, etc. It does affect my speech and organisation. If I didn't use assistive technologies, I would struggle to do the job which I do. But then people without dyslexia also have these issues as well. So in terms of, first of all, the biggest issue would be probably spelling. My children now are, my 9-year-old and my 12-year-old are probably, you know, you don't want to drift into a deficit approach, probably better spellers than what I am, you know, right from the start. And I've had now I've tested out different interventions on myself to see if I can improve, you know, because I'm a researcher and I'm interested in this area. So does this work? Is this and it unfortunately hasn't. So spelling is something which just has never improved. So I've always, you know, I used the early forms of Dragon, Dictate, and at the very beginning doing my degree, you know, and Dragon was so bad then, you know, I got every other word wrong, but it was the way that I could write assignments. I developed a writing style around that. Now, what I didn't use from the very start, which really cost us in my degree, was read-write software. I was given it, but like many students, I didn't see the need of it, and I was just dictating and then trying to read back, although as I know that when I read text, I read it maybe in a different order than what it is on the page. So I can write a sentence or dictate a sentence, and then I read the sentence and it's perfect. And then I listen to it and I realize that actually I've got it the wrong way around and the commas don't make sense, etc.
Like so our brain just assumes that it's saying something. Yes, exactly. I still say to my mum sometimes, I'm like, are you sure I'm dyslexic? I'm sure I'm getting better. And then she'll say to me, sorry, darling, but no, it's not getting better. Oh!
That is that's absolutely correct. That's exactly what happens as well. Sometimes I think that as well. Yeah, this is drifting, but yeah. So that's so basically a combination in terms of me writing. So as I got better, what I do is, and now I do every first draft dictate, because really what I do is I very much I can, I know this might drift into the positive aspects of dyslexia. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, I don't know. But I often can picture, I do think in pictures. When I'm doing research, I can visualize, a story. Stories are really important to us, the narratives which are appearing both statistically and from a qualitative, because I use mixed methods. So very much I visualize and think about what is the overall story here. So to get that story down, I use dictate software, and I dictate everything. So the books, the papers, the research reports, which I've done quite a lot of actually, and I'm very proud of doing that. That's not a brag. I'm very proud of, just because, by the time when I was 18, I had very restricted reading and writing skills. I would never envisage that this would be what I would be doing as a job. Using this technology was almost liberating. I could get my ideas down. And so now what I started doing in my PhD, and this is where I really started defining my writing skills. So I dictate, and I still use this technique. I dictate everything and get me ideas and just pour them down. And that's what I did in my PhD. Now I take a little bit of more of a structured approach. So I will think of the story and put headings, and then I fill in the spaces, and then I move them headings around, because usually they're not in the right order, because how I think of it isn't really, we need to think about, how the neurotypicals read. So we need to have the order so everybody else understands it. So so basically, in terms of, so now that's what I do. And then I fill in with dictate. And then what I do is I read over and then make changes and type. I read over and make some minor ones, which I spot where the dictate's got it wrong. And then I listen. And then that's where I also type and change when I'm going along. But sometimes I need to turn my dictate back on if I've made, and I have to add an extra section. So then I'll dictate, and then it'll be an interaction between dictating and making minor changes, typing. But I'm listening every sentence right the way through. And then I add me references if I haven't already done so. And then I basically listen to the story. And then the last listen is really thinking about the order of things. Am I starting off with a story? Is the story clear at the beginning, and does it follow progression? And have I got my key points across? And have I included all of the narratives? And I've got a very good memory of, well, when people are telling us their stories, I can always remember them stories. So that's great. So then I can go back in and get the writing check. And then also I can think about how they relate to, if I've done a statistical research, to the larger barriers, what people are experiencing. And then I can link it to the statistics. And that's basically my writing style. So it's a really, it's very much using, and I would argue that, this is, and especially we're trying to use this writing style. And this hasn't just been developed by me. One of my ex-students, which I've mentioned, who is a social work practitioner, also uses this technique, and she's using it out in the field in social work practice, and set up her own service. And I see this is a really useful writing style, because it's really bringing people's writing styles. So that's the writing style which I used in my PhD, and that's the writing style I've written every paper and book which I've ever done. So that's the process I go through.
I'm going to try that process, but how long? I don't think I have the patience to do that. I'm very lucky where I have a human editor to help. And so my auntie sits with me while I write my papers, and I'll talk to her, and then she'll help me word it.
Yeah. So, I do use the edit at the very end. So for instance, what I found was when I'm submitting a paper, it was constantly come back, but what I see is really minor issues, the odd comma in the wrong place. And, but you know what publishers are like, they are very, so, I do often, it's not really an editor anymore, but maybe I've used that less and less now as I've developed my own style. So often now I'm really chuffed when it comes back with just a couple of commas in the wrong place. So I still really get things, just a final draft proofread, just to make sure, and the minor things now, and that didn't used to be. So for anybody who's starting to publish and it comes back and they're not, that is fine. That's exactly what it was like for me, and you get used to, because publishing papers when you finish your PhD is a different writing style from your PhD, but you get used to it, and and you've just got to keep on doing it, and get used to the rejections as well. We all get rejected constantly. All what you do is make the corrections and submit it to another journal, and that's fine. It happens to everybody. It happens to me still today, and in terms of, and that's a reality, and that happens to people without dyslexia as well. So we shouldn't be put off by that. So, but for me,
it's taken me a year so far, and it'll be a year next month where I still haven't published my first paper, and it is quite disheartening when you keep getting the rejections and you think, is anyone going to publish this work?
Well, it will get published, and it's a pain in the backside in terms of when it gets sent back to you. Think about what they are saying. I always think about how clear my writing is, and then maybe I need to clarify something. Maybe I need to think about the order of something, and then correct that points if they're relevant. If they're, if they're criticizing it because they don't like it theoretically, then just move on. But in terms of, because I often think that does improve your papers, and then as it went on, I get less and less rejection, but at the very beginning, I got a lot of rejections. So, but I'm drifting off into the back of the PhD in relation to, in terms of the PhD. So that's how I developed my writing style. And the more I used read write software, the better my writing style got, and actually the clearer my story became, and the better I got at publishing journal articles. So I used it not as much as I should have in my PhD, but as my career developed, I've used it more and more. And I would say that's one of the most significant pieces of software. In my degree, I never used it at all, but it really has changed my writing style, using both rather than just one. And also reading. I read for fun, physically read with a book. I read for fun in bed, usually, reading novels, etc. And I think that's important because it was such an achievement, which I described when I read my first book. So I still like to read with a physical book, often an iPad as well, because it makes it easier, because I can enlarge the words, etc., and change change the font settings and things like that. But still, I still like to read it with a physical book. But actually for work, and I realized in the PhD that I really struggled keeping up with the amount of literature which I had to read. So because of that, what I did was I started, first of all, at the time, it wasn't as easy as what it is now, but I ordered in audio books, which I had to order in because it was for people with, visual impairments. So I started using them. It took us ages and it was really clunky. But then as technology developed, we've got audio, and we can all access it. And I set me iPad to do this. So at work now, I listen to everything. So I listen to journal papers, books, everything, students' work, because that allows us to process information quickly. Because if I was to physically read that, it would take us too long. I now have to assess PhDs. Now PhDs are sometimes 100,000 words. So, that would take us a month to read, and I've got a week to assess a PhD. So now I can listen to a PhD, and I've got very good at that, and I can do that in 3.5 days, which maybe is, I don't know if that's longer or quicker than some of my colleagues. I don't think I've ever asked them actually, but that's how long it takes us, 3.5, 4 days to mark a PhD now by listening to it. And I've realized that actually I listen to more and more, and I think that just speeds everything up. I can process, because now I'm working on maybe 3 projects at a time, so I'm reading 3 different sets of literature, so I have to listen to that, and I can do it quite quickly. And I think my work rate is probably, I have probably a higher work rate than many of my colleagues. So it's not that I'm keeping up with colleagues using these techniques. It's not really for me to say, it's for my colleagues to say this, but my workload is up there, and I became quite skilled at doing research, writing papers, getting papers published at quite a quick pace. So and I think, so for me, this is a unique writing style and reading style, and we are going to see stigma. I went to a paper not long ago, and it was a linguistic talking about the loss of the skill of writing, and how terrible people are starting to dictate and listen, and what does that mean to, and I suggested what this is you're presenting a dated view based on dated technology, a pen and a physical book. We've got advances in technology, so because of advances in technology, we've got the development of new writing styles. So all what you're seeing here is a new writing style, and you're missing the point here. So we are probably going to see a backlash on this in terms of stigma, but I think we should be, I think some of my colleagues would maybe be a little bit wary on saying, well, actually I do dictate, and yes, I do listen to read, I do use read and write, and I dictate all my emails, and I'm very open about this because I think we need to challenge and deconstruct that stigma. I don't think my writing is any less than somebody else's writing who physically wrote it with a pen. So that's my writing styles.
We've evolved as how we've written. If you look at hieroglyphics and how we've moved to pen and paper, so this is the new way and the new era.
Exactly. Maybe we're leading the way in terms of what reading and writing will develop into, and I think that's a positive thing rather than a negative thing. So I do see this as a different new writing style which we're now developing, and I think that should be celebrated rather than hidden. And I've also seen, so when I walk into a meeting now and I've got emails, obviously not confidential emails, but I'll walk in a meeting and people are, because everybody's really busy and that answering the emails before the meeting starts. So I will go in and I'll have on my phone and I'll dictate my email and send it off. And I do it all the time, wherever I am. It sometimes drives my wife mad, actually. So I'll just throw off emails. And now I've noticed, actually, within my group in my school, people have started doing that. Who haven't got dyslexia or literacy issues. It's just a really quick way and effective way of firing off emails. So now when I'm starting to see when I go into meetings, lots of people are using that, and I think that's great, isn't it? And I think also, especially for emails, as my careers develop, I think people are used to, work colleagues, if I'm sending an important email, obviously I'll listen to it before I send it out, but I certainly don't do that anymore with what I used to, but it takes too long. So what I do is just fire them off. That's sometimes a little bit muddled. My colleagues have all got used to it. And they will.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much. We've been talking for, it's been great talk, learning about your research and how you've applied it to dyslexia. And I'd love to have you on the show again to talk further if you're happy to do more interviews, particularly on your disability and hate crime and online disability hate speeches. I'd love to learn more about that, and if dyslexia is part of that cohort that you're looking at, because so many people I know are fearful of being on social media because of abusive, bad spelling, or so. And disability as a hate crime is a really fascinating topic for me. So I'd love to be able to explore that further with you at some point.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to talk about that, and by all means come on. And also in terms of, we'll talk about when the interview finishes, but I'm happy to share any papers with you in your group, and if I can be of help of any way, just please let us know.
That would be wonderful. I've written down a lot of different papers that you've mentioned, and it's the way that you structured and how you write your papers has made me think how I really need to try and look at a different process to my old ways, which aren't the best. But also I feel slightly guilty that I haven't used my read and write technology, and I really need to start improving rather than relying on human beings, which has been my habit since I was in secondary school, to use more technology.
Just on that point, I don't want I think people will develop their own strategies, so I don't want to suggest my strategies is the correct strategy to use. I think that it's just how I do it, and that might be useful to some people and it mightn't be. So that please don't think that when I'm describing this a process, it might work for you, it mightn't, it just works for me. But one last thing, actually, which I really think is a real celebration in terms of, well, I think politically, as a person with dyslexia, as a dyslexic person, and now in terms of train people to write academic papers. And I think that's so wonderful in relation to having, an academic with dyslexia talking about how to structure people's stories and write papers is so wonderful. So it really does show that. It really annoys us when people suggest, well, how do you do that because you can't read and write? Well, actually we can. We just use different technologies, and we've got such a unique writing skill, writing, ability to write stories, which actually should be celebrated. And I think the more we do, and we need to remember that as PhD, people in PhD, getting a PhD was the most important thing in my life, because something which I never thought I would achieve, more important than anything else what followed. And we also need to be very open in terms of politically, because we're leading the way in relation to, deconstructing the stigma which is often attached to people who will never even get to university. So I think that's important. And I know it's difficult because of because of issues in the workforce. But, from my point of view, that's why I always try to do things like this, to try to challenge and to try to get people to think about dyslexia in different ways. And hopefully that came across in this interview.
It's been inspirational, and it makes me excited and renewed energy for my research and how I can help add to the body of work that you're doing. So I really, really appreciate your time. It's been just so exciting learning, and your story is inspirational to not be able to read at 18 and then to do the work you're doing now. Just shows our listeners that we can do it with, as we say, with the right tools in place and the right support.
But maybe this is a hub where we can start sharing our work with each other, because we can learn off each other as in terms of our own unique writing style. I've developed one writing style. I'm sure many of yourself and many of your listeners are also developing their unique writing styles. And maybe we should share our work with each other so we've got access to it all. And then we can start really thinking about and unpicking this and looking at is there something unique about what we're doing?
Yeah, that would be wonderful. And I'm hoping that this year we'll be able to start doing something like that. So thank you so much for your time today. I hope you have a wonderful day. Please stay safe in England with what's happening at the moment, but I just really appreciate your time, and I've learned so much tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And it's been lovely speaking to you. And thank you.
If you would like to find out more about Stephen and his work, head to dyslexic.com. Don't forget to keep an eye out for our PhD support group that we have established with Dr. Judith Hudson, and we're so excited that Stephen will also be supporting this initiative. Did you know we now have a new live Q&A series called Question DIS, DYS, created during COVID to help our community feel more connected? Each month I interview a fellow dyslexic about all things dyslexia and life. The Question DIS series is running through Facebook Live. I really hope you can come along and join us for one of these sessions. If you haven't already done so yet, make sure you sign up to our mailing list so you can keep up to date with everything we do at the Foundation. Head to deardyslexic.com. And don't forget, if there is anything you have heard today that was distressing, please call Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36. or Lifeline on 13 11 14. If there is a topic you would like discussed on the show, please email us, admin@deardyslexic.com. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.